December 16th, 1944, 0530 hours, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. A radio operator in a listening post near the Losheim Gap heard something that didn't fit the war he thought he was fighting. Artillery. Not scattered shelling or registration fire, but a continuous roar, rolling through the Ardennes like weather, impossible to place, impossible to count. In the darkness, he clawed for his headset, trying to fix direction and distance, but the sound didn't resolve. It multiplied, overlapped, grew until it felt less like gunfire and more like an avalanche made of steel and explosive. He transmitted the report. No one believed him. Within 6 hours, every assumption about German capability would collapse. An enemy army, judged exhausted and broken, would tear open the Allied line with a violence not seen since 1940. And the frozen forest commanders had written off as impassable would become the corridor through which Germany gambled everything it had left. 300 miles to the rear, in a requisitioned chateau outside Verdun, General Omar Bradley slept under wool blankets that did nothing to stop the cold seeping through stone walls. His last briefing before bed had been unremarkable. The front was stable. German forces were depleted. Intelligence assessments agreed. The enemy lacked the fuel, ammunition, and morale for anything beyond local counterattacks. Christmas was 9 days away. Units were already rotating to rest areas. By every reasonable measure, the war had entered its final act. Bradley did not know that by morning, every one of those conclusions would be catastrophically wrong. The Ardennes had always been quiet sector. Thick forest, narrow roads, poor terrain for armor. Both sides treated it as a place to rest battered divisions or blood-inexperienced ones. American command positioned minimal forces there, gambling that the Germans would never attempt a major offensive through such unfavorable ground. That gamble was based on doctrine, on historical precedent, on rational military analysis. It was also based on arrogance. German planners understood something the Allies had forgotten. Impossible terrain becomes possible when desperation replaces reason. Adolf Hitler had ordered a counteroffensive designed not to win the war, but to delay the inevitable. The target was Antwerp. The method was surprise. The timing was December, when weather would ground Allied air power and turn roads into frozen gauntlets. 25 German divisions, including elite SS panzer formations, had assembled in absolute secrecy. Radio silence was total. Movement occurred only at night. Dummy positions were maintained at old locations, while real units crept forward through fog and darkness. Allied reconnaissance flights saw nothing. Signal intelligence heard nothing. Captured prisoners revealed nothing. And then, at dawn on December 16th, the forest erupted. Artillery fire of a density not seen since the opening of the Eastern Front tore into American positions. Shells walked through command posts, supply dumps, and frontline foxholes with methodical precision. Trees exploded into splinters. Snow turned black with cordite and earth. Men woke to find their positions already bracketed, their radios dead, their escape routes severed. Behind the barrage came armor, panzers and assault guns grinding forward through narrow forest tracks, crushing obstacles, overrunning positions before defenders could register what was happening. Infantry followed in the chaos, clearing bunkers, taking prisoners, pushing deeper into American lines before cohesion could form. Within hours, entire battalions ceased to exist as fighting units. Bradley received the first reports at breakfast. Fragmentary, contradictory. A lieutenant somewhere filed a contact report about enemy armor. Another unit reported heavy shelling. A third went silent mid-transmission. Nothing connected. Nothing made sense. Bradley was methodical by nature and training. He did not panic. He asked questions. He requested clarification. He studied maps, trying to correlate the scattered reports into a coherent picture. But the picture refused to cohere. New reports arrived faster than old ones could be verified. Entire sectors of the front simply disappeared from communication. By midday, the truth began to crystallize with sickening clarity. This was not a local attack. This was an offensive, massive and coordinated, aimed directly at the weakest point in the Allied line. Bradley's staff scrambled to assess the situation. How many divisions? What axis of advance? What reserves were available? The answers came slowly, each one worse than the last. German forces were breaking through in multiple locations. American units were fighting isolated battles, cut off from support, running low on ammunition. Roads clogged with retreating supply units and Belgian refugees, creating chaos that prevented reinforcements from moving forward. And at the center of the breakthrough, like a stone in a river forcing the current to split around it, stood a small Belgian crossroads town few Americans had heard of. Bastogne. The town itself was unremarkable. Medieval streets, stone buildings, a central square, population around 4,000, but its location made it critical. 7 roads converged there, the only viable routes through the Ardennes for mechanized forces. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement. Lose Bastogne, and German armor would pour through, splitting Allied forces, threatening the entire northern front. Bradley understood this immediately. So did the German commanders driving their panzers forward through snow and darkness. The race for Bastogne had begun, and the Americans were already behind. Bradley faced a choice that would haunt him for weeks. He could pull forces from existing operations to shore up the collapsing front, accepting delays in other sectors. Or he could gamble on units already in motion, trusting speed over caution. Every staff officer in the room had an opinion. Some advocated for consolidation. Others demanded immediate counterattack. Intelligence officers updated casualty estimates that climbed by the hour. Logistics officers warned that winter weather was about to worsen, grounding air support indefinitely. Bradley listened to all of it, and then he made the call. The 101st Airborne Division, resting in Reims after brutal fighting in Holland, would move to Bastogne immediately. They would not wait for full equipment. They would not wait for resupply. They would load trucks and go, racing the German panzers for control of a town most of them could not pronounce. The division moved with astonishing speed. Soldiers grabbed weapons, abandoned personal gear, climbed into trucks while engines were still warming. Officers shouted orders over wind and confusion. Within hours, a 10,000-man formation was grinding north through sleet and darkness, heading toward a battle that was already underway. They arrived just in time. German forces reached Bastogne's outskirts to find American paratroopers digging in, transforming the town into a fortress. What should have been an easy capture became a siege. Panzers probed defenses, found them surprisingly strong, and pulled back to wait for artillery support. That delay, measured in hours, proved catastrophic for German timetables. Bastogne held. Barely. Inside the perimeter, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The 101st had deployed without winter clothing. Men wore summer uniforms under Belgian blankets. Boots soaked through and froze solid. Frostbite appeared within days, claiming fingers and toes as efficiently as German fire. Ammunition ran low. Medical supplies dwindled. Wounded soldiers lay in cellars that shook with every artillery impact. Surgeons worked by candlelight, rationing morphine, making decisions about who could be saved and who could not. German forces surrounded the town completely by December 21st. Radio communication became sporadic. Resupply was impossible. The weather kept Allied aircraft grounded, denying even parachute drops. And still the paratroopers held, not because conditions were tolerable, but because retreat meant death. German armor controlled every road. To leave Bastogne meant walking into prepared killing zones. So they stayed, fought, and waited. For what? They did not know. 300 miles south, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. stood in his command post, studying the same maps Bradley was studying, reaching very different conclusions. Patton had built a reputation on motion. He believed wars were won by commanders who acted faster than their opponents could think. Hesitation, to Patton, was a form of cowardice. Planning mattered, but only if it enabled speed. Every hour spent deliberating was an hour given to the enemy. When news of the German offensive reached Patton's headquarters, his staff expected fury. Instead, they witnessed something close to exhilaration. Patton saw opportunity where others saw crisis. The Germans had overextended. They were gambling everything on speed and surprise. If that momentum could be broken, if their advance could be stopped and reversed, the entire offensive would collapse. Patton began planning immediately, before Bradley called, before orders arrived, before anyone asked. He assembled his operations staff and posed a question that seemed insane. How fast can we turn 90 degrees north and attack the German flank? Staff officers stared. Patton's Third Army was engaged in operations pushing east toward the Saar. To disengage, pivot north, and launch a coordinated offensive meant reversing an entire army's axis of advance in the middle of winter. It meant rerouting supply convoys, rewriting attack plans, coordinating with units currently in contact with the enemy. It was impossible. Patton asked the question again. His staff began calculating, not whether it could be done, but how. They worked through the night, mapping routes, identifying choke points, calculating fuel requirements. Patton moved between tables, demanding faster timelines, rejecting caution, insisting on answers measured in hours, not days. By dawn, he had a plan. When Bradley's summons arrived on December 19th, Patton was ready. The meeting took place in Verdun, in a cold room with bad lighting and worse coffee. Maps covered every surface. Eisenhower presided. Bradley explained the situation with his characteristic precision. Bastogne was surrounded. The 101st Airborne was running out of time. German forces were pressing the siege harder every day. Weather forecasts showed no improvement. "How soon can you attack?" Patton's response became legend. December 22nd, 48 hours. The room went silent. Staff officers exchanged glances. Turning an army of that size, in that time frame, violated every principle of prudent command. Supply lines would stretch. Units would become separated. Coordination would suffer. Bradley studied Patton's face, looking for bluster, for overconfidence, for the recklessness that had caused problems before. But what he saw was different. Patton was serious. He had already done the calculations. He believed it was possible because he had made it possible. Bradley authorized the attack. What followed tested every soldier in Patton's Third Army. Units received orders to disengage from current operations, pull back to assembly areas, pivot north, and advance through some of the worst terrain in Europe during the worst weather in decades. Trucks moved bumper to bumper through darkness, ice-coated roads until traction disappeared. Vehicles slid off embankments, blocking routes for hours. Engineers worked without rest, clearing obstacles, reinforcing bridges, laying steel planking over frozen mud. Tank crews slept in their vehicles, engines idling to prevent freezing. Infantry rode in open trucks, packed so tight that body heat became the only defense against cold that hovered near zero. Soldiers wrapped their feet in newspaper under their boots. Some tied rags around their faces to prevent frostbite. Supply officers performed miracles. Fuel convoys rerouted mid-journey. Ammunition dumps relocated overnight. Field kitchens served meals in darkness, rationing coffee, stretching rations to cover unexpected delays. And through it all, Patton drove his commanders relentlessly. He appeared at forward positions without warning, demanding updates, cursing delays, pushing units to move faster. He did not ask for comfort. He did not offer sympathy. He simply insisted that it could be done, and by sheer force of will, made it true. German intelligence detected the movement, but misinterpreted its scale. They believed Patton was shifting reserves, not launching a full offensive. By the time they understood the truth, American armor was already striking their southern flank. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers knew nothing of Patton's maneuver. They knew only that ammunition was nearly exhausted, medical supplies were gone, and German attacks intensified daily. Officers moved through positions, repeating the same message: hold, just hold. On December 22nd, German commanders sent a surrender demand under flag of truce. The message was formal, almost polite, offering honorable terms and warning of annihilation if refused. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting division commander, read the demand and reportedly responded with a single word: nuts. The German officers did not understand. An American translator explained. It meant no, emphatically. The siege continued. By December 24th, Bastogne was dying. Artillery fire had reduced entire blocks to rubble. Smoke hung permanent over the town. Dead soldiers were stacked in frozen courtyards because ground was too hard to dig graves. Wounded men lay in basements, infections spreading, morphine long exhausted. Ammunition was critically low. Machine gun crews had orders to fire only when targets were certain. Mortar teams saved their last rounds for massed assaults. Rifle platoons counted bullets, doing math that measured survival in single shots. Food was gone. Soldiers ate snow for hydration. Some chewed on leather from abandoned equipment. Hunger became constant background noise, like artillery, always present, gradually weakening resistance. But morale held, sustained by stubborn pride and rumors of relief. Someone had heard a radio transmission. Someone else claimed to have seen American aircraft. The stories spread not because they were verified, but because they were needed. South of Bastogne, Patton's armor was grinding forward through resistance that stiffened with every mile. German forces, realizing the threat, diverted panzers from the siege to block the advance. The fighting became brutal. Villages changed hands multiple times. Tank battles erupted in forest clearings, armor firing at point-blank range through trees and smoke. Casualties mounted. American units pushed through, regrouped, pushed again. Patton refused to slow down. Every hour mattered. Every delay meant more paratroopers dying in Bastogne. On Christmas Day, the weather finally broke. Clouds parted. Sunlight hit snow for the first time in days. Allied aircraft lifted off from bases across France and Belgium, carrying supplies desperately needed in Bastogne. The first drops were chaotic. Parachutes drifted into German lines. Some loads exploded on impact, but enough got through. Medical supplies, ammunition, surgical equipment, and most importantly, evidence that they were not forgotten. Soldiers in Bastogne watched the sky fill with parachutes and wept. If you made it this far, you're the reason channels like ours can keep the past alive. Let me know where you're tuning in from, drop a like, and subscribe so these voices from history continue to be heard. December 26th, 1944, 1645 hours, 4 kilometers south of Bastogne. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, reached a crossroads that intelligence maps showed as heavily defended. His tanks had been fighting continuously for 3 days. Crews operated on 2 hours of sleep in 72. Ammunition was down to half loads. 3 of his lead Shermans trailed smoke from damage sustained in morning fighting. Fuel gauges hovered near empty. The corridor behind him, the lifeline connecting his battalion to the rest of Patton's army, was so narrow that German fire could cut it at any moment. One well-placed counterattack, and Abrams would be as isolated as the men in Bastogne. He attacked anyway. Armor surged forward through German positions that had not expected such aggression from forces that should have been exhausted. Machine gun fire rattled off tank hulls. Panzerfausts streaked past, missing by meters. Abrams' lead tank crushed a roadblock, firing main gun rounds into defensive positions at ranges so close that muzzle blast shook infantry nearby. Commanders screamed orders into radios. Gunners fired until barrels glowed. Drivers pushed engines beyond safe limits. The German line broke. Abrams pushed through, radioing back that the road was open. Behind him, more armor followed, widening the corridor, securing flanks, establishing a fragile lifeline into Bastogne. One corridor, one road, between the encircled 101st and survival. Inside the town, soldiers heard engines. Not German engines, American. The sound grew louder, closer, impossible to ignore. Men stood from positions they had not left in days, moving toward the sound, not quite believing. The first Sherman tank rolled into Bastogne's perimeter at 1650 hours. Soldiers swarmed it, touching steel as if to verify reality. More tanks followed, then trucks, then medics, ammunition carriers, fuel bowsers. The siege was over. Relief came without fanfare. There were no speeches, no formal ceremonies, just exhausted soldiers greeting other exhausted soldiers, sharing cigarettes, trading information about who had survived and who had not. Wounded were evacuated immediately. Medical teams worked through the night, triaging cases, performing surgeries that had been delayed for days. Some men saved, others beyond saving, kept alive only by cold that had slowed infections. Supplies flowed in steadily, hot food, winter clothing, ammunition to replace what had been burned through in desperate fighting. Engineers began clearing rubble, restoring roads, rebuilding defensive positions. And through it all, word spread across Allied lines. Bastogne held. Patton broke through. The German offensive was blunted. The numbers told part of the story. The 101st Airborne suffered nearly 2,000 casualties during the siege, 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, 516 missing. Patton's Third Army lost hundreds more during the relief operation. German forces lost irreplaceable armor, elite SS divisions ground down in fighting that produced no strategic gain. But numbers could not capture what happened in that frozen Belgian town during the darkest week of winter. Bastogne proved that American soldiers, when surrounded and outgunned, would fight with a stubbornness that doctrine could not predict. It proved that airborne infantry, designed for rapid insertion and withdrawal, could hold ground as tenaciously as any formation in the war. It proved that bold action, when timed correctly, could overcome impossible odds. And it proved that Bradley's decision to trust Patton, despite misgivings, despite stylistic differences, despite past controversies, was correct. Patton's maneuver would later be analyzed in military colleges worldwide. The pivot from offensive operations to relief operation, executed in 48 hours during winter conditions, became a case study in aggressive leadership. Staff officers would debate whether it was brilliant or reckless. Historians would argue about alternatives. But for the men who lived it, The analysis was simpler. It worked. When the war ended 5 months later, Bradley returned to a world that felt disorienting in its quietness. No radio reports, no casualty lists, no maps updated with grease pencil marking advances and retreats. He thought about Patton often during those early months of peace. They had fought together across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. They had argued, compromised, and pushed each other toward decisions neither would have made alone. Patton died in December 1945, killed in a traffic accident in occupied Germany. The news reached Bradley while he was attending meetings about post-war military structure. He excused himself, found a quiet room, and sat alone with memories that suddenly felt unbearably final. Later, when historians began writing official accounts, Bradley was asked repeatedly about Patton, about their relationship, about Bastogne specifically, about whether he had truly trusted Patton or simply had no other choice. Bradley's answers revealed careful thought. He acknowledged that Patton's relief operation succeeded because Patton had prepared for it before anyone asked. The contingency plans, the staff work, the mental preparation for exactly that kind of crisis, all existed before the German offensive began. Patton had not improvised. He had anticipated. That distinction mattered to Bradley. It separated recklessness from calculated risk. Patton appeared impulsive, but beneath the bravado lay meticulous preparation. He could move fast because he had already planned fast movement. Bradley also reflected on what the siege revealed about American soldiers. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne had been thrown into an impossible situation with inadequate equipment and no clear timeline for relief. Conventional wisdom suggested they would break. Instead, they endured through training, unit cohesion, and leadership at every level. Bradley understood that Patton's breakthrough mattered only because the 101st gave him time to execute it. If Bastogne had fallen on December 23rd or 24th, Patton's relief force would have arrived too late. The two actions, defense and relief, were inseparable. Authorizing Patton's attack was among the hardest decisions Bradley made during the war. Not because he doubted Patton's ability, but because he understood the consequences of failure. If Patton's maneuver had collapsed, if his forces had been stopped short, the 101st Airborne would have been annihilated. An entire American division destroyed while relief forces struggled miles away. The political and psychological impact would have been devastating. Bradley carried that weight through every hour of Patton's advance. And when the message arrived that Abrams had broken through, Bradley felt relief so profound it bordered on physical pain. But Bradley also recognized his own limitations. He was brilliant at coordination, at managing complex operations across vast fronts. But he was not suited for the decisive, aggressive action Bastogne required. Patton was. That recognition required humility, accepting that his command style, while effective in many contexts, was insufficient in others. In the post-war years, as Bradley rose to become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Bastogne shaped his strategic thinking in lasting ways. The siege taught him that speed could be as decisive as firepower, that combined arms required commanders who understood how different forces reinforced each other in real combat, and that morale was measurable in how long soldiers held impossible positions. Most importantly, it taught him that trust between commanders mattered more than organizational charts suggested. Bradley and Patton had different personalities, different approaches, different strengths, but they trusted each other at the critical moment, enabling decisive action when hesitation would have led to disaster. When Bradley spoke about Patton in later years, he avoided hagiography. He acknowledged controversies and diplomatic disasters, but he refused to diminish what Patton accomplished. At Bastogne and in numerous other battles, Patton demonstrated qualities no other American commander possessed in equal measure: the ability to move large formations with extraordinary speed, the willingness to accept risk when circumstances demanded it, the instinct for when to attack. Bradley characterized Patton as a commander for emergencies. The phrase acknowledged that Patton thrived in crisis, that his talents emerged most clearly when situations were desperate and conventional responses inadequate. December 1944 was such an emergency, and Patton was exactly what America needed. Bastogne entered American consciousness as a symbol of resilience. Films, books, and documentaries portrayed the siege in increasingly dramatic terms. The nuts response became legendary. The 101st became known as the battered bastards of Bastogne. Bradley understood the public's need for heroes, for simple narratives, but he also knew the reality had been messier, more uncertain, more dependent on timing and luck than mythology acknowledged. The truth was that Bastogne succeeded because of convergent factors: the 101st's defensive tenacity, Patton's aggressive relief, Allied air power, German logistical failures, decisions by junior officers, and yes, luck. Remove any one factor and the outcome changes. Yet mythology served a purpose. It inspired future soldiers. It created cohesion through shared history. So Bradley participated in commemorations, gave interviews, attended reunions, preserving in private writings a more nuanced record while allowing public memory its necessary simplifications. In December 1974, 30 years after the siege, Bradley attended a Bastogne anniversary commemoration. He was 81, frail, but determined to honor the men who had fought there. A veteran approached him privately, a rifleman in the 101st, wounded during the siege, evacuated during Patton's relief. The man asked a simple question: "Did you ever doubt we would hold?" Bradley considered carefully before answering. He admitted that yes, there were moments of deep doubt, moments when reports suggested the situation was collapsing, moments when he wondered if asking the 101st to hold Bastogne was asking too much. But he also said that doubt and decision were different things. Leaders doubted constantly. It was part of command's burden, but they acted anyway, choosing the best path, even when no path seemed adequate. The veteran nodded, shook Bradley's hand, and walked away. Reflecting later, Bradley realized this encapsulated something essential about leadership and memory. The soldiers at Bastogne carried their own doubts, their own fears, their own moments of wondering if survival was possible. But they acted anyway. They held their positions. They trusted relief would come. And when Patton broke through, when American tanks rolled into that frozen town on December 26th, what had seemed impossible became history. That transformation, from desperate uncertainty to historical inevitability, was what Bastogne represented. Not the triumph of planning or the victory of doctrine, but the resilience of human will under conditions that should have shattered it. Bradley understood that Patton's maneuver saved the 101st Airborne, but the 101st's endurance saved Patton's reputation. If they had surrendered before relief arrived, Patton's bold gamble would have been remembered as tragic failure. Instead, it became legend, and in that legend, forged in snow and blood and stubborn refusal to yield, lay the truth Bradley carried for the rest of his life. War required many kinds of courage: the courage to attack, to defend, to trust, and to decide even when doubt whispered that the situation was hopeless. At Bastogne in December 1944, American command demonstrated all those forms of courage, and in doing so, they turned the tide of the war's final winter, proving that when leadership, preparation, and will converged, even the impossible became merely difficult. And the difficult, given enough blood and determination, became achievable.